Welcome to The Dirt, an economics podcast bringing you the down and dirty agronomic science behind growing better crops and bigger returns. Backed by Nutrien-economics.com, we break down the latest research, news, and insights to help farmers make better business decisions. Let's dig in.
Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of The Dirt. I'm your moderator today, Dr. Alan Blaylock, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. We're happy to have you all with us. Today we have a couple of guests that I've known for a number of years, and we're going to talk about something that is a pretty common topic in the world of nutrient management, and that is soil testing. We'll get into that here shortly. But before we get started with that, I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about what you do, where you are, and then we'll get into the topic at hand. So, Carl, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm Carl Rosen. I'm an extension soil scientist at the University of Minnesota and Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. I work primarily on specialty crops. I do a lot on irrigated agriculture, but my nutrient management area tends to be more with potatoes and other crops in that rotation. I do a lot on nitrogen management, but have also got into the other nutrients as well. Phosphorus and potassium, of course, extremely important. So that's mainly what I'm working on these days.
Thanks, Carl. Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
My name's Daniel Kaiser. I'm pretty much what Carl does, only with conventional crops. So I'm a nutrient management specialist at the University of Minnesota. I work primarily on the fertilizer guidelines for our conventional cropping systems. I work a lot with soil testing. It's kind of the basis of what I do because most of my work is focused on phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, micronutrients, those types of things that soil tests are more common in. So I've been here for close to 20 years. A lot of my research is on corn and soybean production. I will dabble into some of the smaller acreage crops, sugar beet production, dry beans, doing some small grains work, hard red spring wheat, hard red winter wheat, some winter rye, and then also this year we're working on some oat research, looking at some interests some growers have. So kind of get my fingers into a little bit of everything here in the large state of Minnesota that tends to be rather diverse and a lot of issues in Minnesota that makes it interesting for me since we deal with situations where our soils are similar to more of the Corn Belt. And I also have soils that behave a lot like some of the Central Plains, some of the Western soils. So it keeps me on my toes here with the research I do in Minnesota.
Thanks, Dan and Carl. We're glad to have you here today. Glad you could join us on this discussion of soil testing. And to our listeners, you can tell we have a couple of very experienced experts and soil scientists who have done a lot of work with soil testing. So let's get into it. To start with, let's briefly review what the concept of soil testing is. So Dan, we'll start with you. What is soil testing about? What are we trying to do? And what do we accomplish with that soil testing?
Well, what a soil test is, it's a combination of a couple different things. One, it's a specific soil sampling depth, and then it's a chemical extractant that's meant to measure one or more nutrients. Soil tests themselves are meant to be indexes of availability for the most part. What that means is what we're trying to do is take a concentration of a nutrient at a given depth and relate it back to some sort of sufficiency range of availability for a particular crop. And that's how you can view, if you're looking at soil tests, generally there's different categories that we break our tests into. We see like very low, low, medium, high, and very high. And what those typically relate to is the ability of a soil to supply a given nutrient. So, say a soil is low in phosphorus, there's a low probability that that soil is going to be able to supply sufficient nutrient for that crop within a given year. So that's one thing that's really important with soil tests. If you look at, there's a lot of variation across the U.S. in terms of what tests are used. The tests only measure a certain fraction of a given nutrient. For the most part, nitrogen, nitrate is, kind of something that's a little bit different, that we can measure more of the total that's there. But, generally we're not trying to measure the total. We're just trying to give ourselves an idea of what the availability of a given nutrient is. So many times you'll see a soil test. The reports will be in parts per million and not in pounds per acre. There's a few states that still use pounds per acre. But that was foregone a few years ago by many states just because, again, it's an index and it's not really meant to be the total available. So when you're looking at a soil test, say for phosphorus or potassium, you're really, again, just looking at what the general sufficiency of those nutrients are based on research in a given state or a given area or region of what that availability would be.
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad you used that word index because sometimes we get this misperception that soil test reports in X pounds per acre, how much phosphorus or potassium or whatever nutrient I have is available. And so I think that that's the actual value that the plant is going to see, what it's going to have available to it. But really, it's an index, and a term I've used in some of my work is I call it a probability indicator. It's a value that's telling me the likelihood of getting a response to fertilizer rather than the exact amount that the plant can take up. Carl, anything you wish to add to that from your perspective? Does it work the same for some of these specialty crops as it does for the grain crops?
Well, yeah, thanks, Alan. I think a lot of the calibration has been done on some of the main agronomic crops, pretty much corn, some of the small grains, soybeans. There's less calibration work that's done on the specialty crops, so we often use those other crops as a starting point, and then we'll kind of adjust as necessary. I would say, to reiterate, it is a probability of response. So if you have a low soil test level, then you would have a higher probability of response to fertilizer if it's added. If you have a high soil test level, then the probability of response to fertilizer becomes less. So that was the main thing that I wanted to bring out from that standpoint of, the probability aspect, index aspect. I think the one thing that people often think about or talk about is that it's an actual amount of fertilizer that might be in there, and that's not the correct way to look at it. And that's why we did get rid of pounds per acre in terms of these immobile nutrients. I think that if you look at it as more of a probability of response, that's the best way to look at these the numbers off of the soil test report.
Thanks, Carl. So, Dan, you and Carl have both mentioned a couple of things. Dan, you specifically referred to taking a sample. Soil test consists of taking a sample and then doing a chemical extraction. But I think there's a third part of that we also need to consider, and that's the interpretation of what that value actually means. And so we've kind of talked around that, but that's also a part of the process. Now, as we look at this, which of those kind of three aspects of that soil testing do you see as maybe the greatest source of error or variability in that whole process?
So if you look at a soil test, really the biggest source of error is going to be in the sample collection. That's really where we see more of the issues. And there's been some classic work done. I know my major professor down in Iowa, Antonio Malorino, did some work a number of years ago looking at phosphorus and looking at the degree of error associated with the value based on the number of cores you take. It's one of the things that I think people don't think about sometimes with some of the grid point sampling, that it's still important to get a number of separate cores, particularly if you've got a small soil sample tube that's less than like an inch in diameter. You're not getting a whole lot of soil, so it's easy if you say hit a hot spot or somewhere that maybe a little bit more fertilizer is dumped, you can get an inflated result that you really need to have a larger number of cores to get good average sampling, because in effect, if you look at the extraction side of it, most labs are certified, which what that means is they go through a program, they get double-blind samples sent to them. that then what they can do is extract the samples and compare it to other labs to hopefully then that their procedure and what they're doing is consistent with what everybody else is doing, that they're returning a result within about 5% error of the other labs. So, looking at then the calibration side, that really relies on the accuracy of the other two. So, I think, where we get to the most error really, and people what they need to think about is their sampling strategy, because if your sampling strategy is all off, it's kind of one of that old adages, garbage in, garbage out. It's kind of what you end up getting with it is that if you don't have some care in terms of what you're doing at the start, it can really screw up what you're trying to do at the end.
Okay, that's great. I'm glad you covered that. Carl, you work with some of the specialty crops and particularly potatoes, and you and I have worked together on a number of different things. You mentioned earlier that you work with nitrogen. How does this whole process work for nitrogen sampling? Because that's a bit different. It doesn't accumulate so much in the soil. It's highly transient in the soil. So how does this soil testing process work in predicting the availability or crop response to nitrogen?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question, Alan. So nitrogen's a little different than the other nutrients we were talking about. Phosphorus and potassium are what we call more or less immobile nutrients. Nitrogen, on the other hand, is a mobile nutrient and can fluctuate quite rapidly within the soil and quickly within the soil over the course of a growing season. If you have a rainfall, that can leach the nitrogen out very easily, depending on the soil. And most of the nitrogen that's in the soil is not so much attached to the soil particles, but mostly in the organic matter, total organic matter. So what we measure with nitrate is basically the nitrogen or the nitrate that's in that soil profile. We usually go to a deeper depth, 2 feet, because that's the root system that can access that nitrogen. And unlike the immobile nutrients, it's an extract, and it gives you a point in time how much nitrogen is in that soil. It doesn't measure total nitrogen, it just measures the available nitrogen that's there. It's on a very sandy soil, and you have a rainfall. If you measure it one day, it could be gone the next. So we don't really rely a lot on soil testing as a predictive purpose to say what's there on these sandy soils. If you have a more finer textured soil, nitrate might accumulate from previous years. You can use that. If you have manure applications, you can use the nitrate test there to determine how much nitrate might be available for the crop. But what you measure with nitrate is available for the crop. And we often measure that in pounds per acre, unlike the immobile nutrients, which is parts per million or an index. What you see there for nitrogen is there and available for the crop.
But I think it's important to point out what you said there is that that's a measurement at that point in time. It's what's available to the crop at that point in time, and it is quantitative for that point in time, but that value, as you indicated, can change. So it's important that we understand the differences between the nutrients for which we're sampling and what that value actually means. So both of you were co-authors on a recent piece from the University of Minnesota with your extension colleague, Brad Carlson, talking about myths of soil testing. Let's get into that just a little bit. What are some of the things that a soil test does not do?
Well, I think one of the things, Alan, that you mentioned before is that we're only measuring a certain fraction of the nutrient. So it's an index of availability. And I think that's one of the things that people think that you can use it and tell what exactly how many pounds are going to be taken up by the crop. And that just isn't the case, because I'll just go back to phosphorus. If you look at some of our soils in western Minnesota that have a lot of calcium in it, we've got a lot of calcium-bound phosphorus in there. So your total phosphorus, it isn't uncommon to see about 2,000 part per million total phosphorus, but the available fraction based on the Olsen test is about 3 ppm. It doesn't tell you the total. It's not really as good at telling you the buffering or how well the less available fractions are going to convert into the available fractions. So it's one of the things that you want to avoid. I can go back to the nitrogen test too. I mean, Carl mentioned nitrate. One of things that we'll get questions on for people that fall applied nitrogen will be, can I use an ammonia test? Because you can measure ammonium in the soil too to figure out how much of my nitrogen fertilizer there. And it just doesn't do that. So that's one of the things I think just to watch out for is that what we call like a mass balance system, which essentially is taking a test and figuring out the total amount that's there relative to the total amount the crop is taking up. We can't really do that with a soil test. And there's some soil tests out there that claim to do that, but they don't really factor in a lot of the differences that we see, what we call that buffering capacity, or because with phosphorus, you get essentially that the roots will deplete the area right around the roots pretty quickly. It's so they have to continually grow new roots to new locations because the phosphorus doesn't move very much in the soil, that it really doesn't tell you kind of all those dynamics that are occurring in that. So I think that's number one, is really looking at that it's not going to give you the total availability. Again, it's an index that you have to look at more than anything else.
Carl, anything you care to add to that?
One thing I want to mention is that our soil test interpretations are based on many, many years of research. And thinking that you can come up with a new test and, have numbers out there that mean something is, in my opinion, a myth. You can't do it. You need to have a lot of years of research behind those numbers that are out there. And I would say many of these tests, the extractants that Dan talked about earlier, they've been around for 40, 50 years or more. And so we have a lot of years of experience with those extractants, so we know what to expect. You come up with something different, you're going to have another whole set of research to help to be able to interpret those numbers.
Okay, you've both mentioned a couple of different tests. What are some of those tests, and which are most reliable? Which tests should we be using for my soil? Because I can go to a lab in one state and get a different test than, say, a lab in Minnesota, and how do I know which one is best? Let's talk about that just a little bit, because there are a variety of different tests, and phosphorus is a great example. We have many different methods of extraction. So let's talk about some of those tests. Sort that out for me a bit.
So that's one of the things that we see more now than we've seen in the past, is a push towards a single extraction solution across the U.S. And a lot of this is, you see the NRCS really pushing towards what we call the Blaylock 3 test, because the Blaylock 3 test is a universal extractant. It'll extract phosphorus, potassium, a lot of your metals, your micronutrients, calcium, magnesium. There's some places I think that will use it for sulfate as well. And so it's just a single extraction solution that's really beneficial to labs, because you just can extract one sample and get multiple tests. Versus what we recommend here in Minnesota is we have the Bray and the Olson test for phosphorus. The Bray P1, there's a Bray P2. When you see these things, the thing you have to realize is that they're different extraction solutions. So we have to calibrate them separately in order to make those different ranges, the low, medium, high, very high, to make sure we make them useful. So that's one of the things you just have to watch out for, is depending on how you're running the sample, it really affects what you'll see for that end interpretation. And particularly with phosphorus, that's really important, is you need to know what test is being run to make sure that when you're looking at a set of recommendations that you're using the right one. Because I can't take the Olson recommendations and use them with a Bray extraction. It doesn't work, because they extract different pools of nutrients. So that's really the big thing that we see. I mean, it's really phosphorus is really the big one. Nitrate, I think, is less affected with extraction solutions just because of how water soluble nitrate is. Potassium, there's a few different methods out of there that you'll see differences in terms of the extraction solutions and the micros and all those. So that's really the main thing, is when you're getting a test, it isn't necessarily that one's better than the other unless you've got a bigger data set that calibrates that particular test. And that's where I would say that things tend to sort out. Is like here in Minnesota, we've got a lot of data on the Bray P1 and the Olson versus the Blaylock 3 that I'm more comfortable with those recommendations right now just because of the historical data set. So that's really the big thing, is you just need to make sure that if you're trying to get a recommendation, that what you're using for the test is valid for that recommendation that you're using.
So I think that's a really key point, Dan, that you both talked to here, and that is that whatever test we're using, we need to have that calibration work that's been done. That means a lot of research going into studying that test and how it relates to the crop response and the predictability of that crop response based on that test. And so whatever test we use, we need to make sure that we're using something that has that research basis behind it. Now, Carl, you work a lot with the specialty crops, and I know potatoes have a very different nutrient requirements than, say, corn and the small grains. Do we use the same test methods and the same approach on those specialty crops, and particularly under irrigation? That's a very different environment. Do we use the same approach for those cropping systems?
We use the same tests, that's for sure. Whether we use the same approach, probably a little bit different. We didn't really talk much about soil test philosophy because you can have this build and maintain approach or a sufficiency level approach. And I think with the specialty crops, they're higher value. You tend to go more with the build and maintain because, small amounts of fertilizer can improve yields, and small amounts of yield can be cover the cost of the fertilizer more easily than it can with some of the more commodity crops like corn and soybeans. So with specialty crops, we tend to use a little bit more of the build and maintain approach, but it's still the idea of soil testing is still just as appropriate with those crops. Yeah, so I think the other thing I wanted to mention about the different phosphorus tests as well, when we talk about Bray and Olsen, we're mainly talking about soil pH because the Olsen test is a test that's used when the pH is more in that alkaline range above 7.4, whereas the Bray test is used on that more slightly alkaline to acidic conditions. And then the Blaylock test was developed on the East Coast, so it tends to track very well with Bray, the Bray test. Although, because you're just doing one extractant, the measurement could be a little bit different with Bray versus Blaylock, in that you're doing what we call an ICP, more of a multi-element approach as opposed to spectrophotometry, which is used with the Bray. And so those numbers will be different. And so sometimes you're going to get different numbers with that test when you compare a Blaylock versus a Bray test. So yeah, there's all these little idiosyncrasies, kind of little details that we know behind the scenes that labs are doing. And so that can, again, affect some of the results and interpretation down the line as well.
Okay, Carl, you threw out a couple of terms there, and just for the benefit of our listeners who may not understand these terms, would you clarify just briefly what is meant by a sufficiency level philosophy or approach versus a build and maintain approach? What does that mean, and what are the differences in those two approaches?
So the sufficiency level approach is based on a soil test level in different categories. You have low, medium, high. And in that approach, if you're in that low range, you'll generally apply a certain amount of fertilizer to achieve an optimal response. The build and maintenance approach is you build that up to a certain level so that the probabilities of response is much lower. So you're at that point, you're just adding fertilizer to account for any uptake or any removal that might be occurring during that cropping season. So build and maintain is you build that up to a high level and then just add any fertilizer that might be removed during that season. Sufficiency level is you might let it go down to a certain level at a time and then add more fertilizer to get the required response.
So in one case, the sufficiency level, we're targeting more of a level of supply from the soil, and we're going to fertilize according to that estimated supply based on the soil test. And the build and maintain, we're targeting that maintenance part of that. I mean, the build part of it is really a lot, in my eyes, it seems a lot the same as the sufficiency approach. It's that maintenance approach. Once we get to a certain level and we say, okay, we're going to maintain here, and then we're applying, as you said, like a crop removal amount. So subtle differences, but it is important in how you approach that, and the economics of those can be quite different as well.
Right.
And so the grower needs to factor the economics into those decisions as they determine how they're going to manage those nutrients. So I think those are important distinctions to make. And again, we come back to this idea of calibration and having a research base on which to justify those fertilizer recommendations according to what we find in that soil test. So let's talk just a little bit about laboratory chemistry and lab performance. One of you mentioned, I don't remember which of you mentioned, this certification process that many labs participate in. How good is the quality of the work, the actual chemistry in the laboratory? How reliable is that part of this process?
The chemistry is the chemistry. I mean, it should be reliable. I mean, if you're using the same procedures, the same extraction solutions, the bigger thing where you can get where you get off somewhat is that in most cases, the elements themselves that we're looking at in these extraction solutions, the machines that are being used aren't measuring them directly. It isn't that I scan it and it's telling me exactly how much phosphorus is there. What it does a lot of times is these machines, they're measuring absorbance or light absorbance or emittance or something that's occurring there, and you have to calibrate them to a set of what we call reference standards. So what we have is a known concentration. Let's say we're doing absorbance, where you're shining a light through at a certain wavelength and seeing how much of that's absorbed, that the machine knows based on a certain concentrations what the absorbance should be, then it relates it back to the unknown sample. So there's a few things that can kind of come into play when it comes to some variation, but in effect, I mean, if you're using the same extraction solutions, the same procedures and everything else, I mean, it should be the same, within roughly maybe 5% of error from lab to lab. So you shouldn't see as much variation with that, but there's just a lot of things that go into it because, again, you just don't have a machine that's reading the exact concentrations. It's reading them against a known set of standards, and there's some errors that can be associated with it, specifically that. And then the other thing, too, is with the sample extraction and weighing. Most labs, when you get a sample in, what we're doing is we're doing our analysis based on mass. But when they get the sample in, they'll dry it, they'll grind it. Hopefully it'll be dried down to a constant moisture. I mean, hopefully as close to zero as possible. Then they take a scoop or a calibrated scoop, essentially, that has a volume that's estimated to have the mass that you're looking for, say 1 or 2 grams or whatever the test results are. So there's a few things that come into play. I mean, if you got the new person on scooping, you can see a lot of variation. I mean, it's not really where you want the new person doing. And then getting into setting all these machines, you can get some variation. So that's where we'd like to see within 5%. But we realize when you look at a lot of these proficiency testing programs is they'll give those labs a result back and just see where they're at in terms of their precision and their bias, which the precision is how close to that target is, and then they'll work through them in terms of figuring out where exactly, if they do have issues, where those problems are.
Again, this word calibration keeps coming up. We have to calibrate our methodologies. The laboratory has to calibrate instruments. The laboratory has to go through various calibrations to make sure that a number that they're producing from this analysis means something in reference to that sample. So this word calibration just keeps appearing over and over throughout this process. Let's talk just a little bit. We'll come back to this sampling business for just a moment and talk just a little bit about the sampling. Now, many people they'll take some number of soil samples from a field, and then we also want to touch on this business of zone or grid sampling. But talk just a little bit about proper sampling procedures and how those might vary for different situations. Carl, we'll go to you first.
Sure.
What do you recommend for soil sampling processes?
So, as Dan mentioned, soil sampling can often be the weakest link in a soil testing program. If the sample is not representative of the field that you're wanting to fertilize, then the numbers that you get out are not going to be very useful. So normally what we say is that for traditional soil sampling, no more than 20 acres for a field. And for that, you would want at least 20 or so, 15 to 20 subsamples to represent that. And by 20 acres, that should be a relatively uniform field. If you have a lot of topography in there, you would probably want to break that down into no more than 5 acres in a field. And obviously, the more samples you get in smaller areas, the more accurate you will know what the nutrient levels are in those soils. When you're taking a sample on 20 acres and send it to the lab, you're maybe sending 1 pound of soil to the lab, and the lab will be analyzing maybe 5 grams of soil to represent that 20 acres. So getting that sample is extremely important to have that from a uniform area.
Dan, I think you've done some work with grid and zone sampling. What's different about that, and where would that be an advantage for me?
I mean, Alan, it really depends on the situation the grower's in. I mean, really, when it comes to grid versus zone, I don't think there's a best option for all fields. Normally, what I recommend most growers do is, if you're going into a new field, you don't know much about that field, is doing more of maybe a tighter grid, like a 2.5 acre grid measurement, and then see what your soil tests are. And then, if you've got a lot of consistency in these fields, you could go to something like a zone sampling, which, a lot of people for zone sampling, what they use are soil map units, which aren't perfect. If you look at it, it's more of a concept than it is an absolute. If you look at a map unit within a field, and I think a lot of people would recognize that as there's no abrupt line that changes from one soil type to the other. So that's one of the challenges with something like a zone sampling, that, whether or not you're getting all the variability. Certainly past history, if there's an old hog lot that was on the part of the field, you may want to break that off and sample it separately, because it's likely going to inflate your results if you take a few cores from that area. And it's really key is trying to get as representative a sample as possible. But you have to realize, though, that there's no perfect solution, because you can get as much variation within a zone as you would across a field. So, really kind of where I said my really approach when I look at this with grids is there's nothing wrong with doing, 2.5, 5 acre grids within fields. But, I think it's a good stepping off point. If you don't know what's going on, then starting it. And for growers that are in, say, a build and maintenance program, like we talked about before, if you're maintaining your soil test at or just slightly above what we call the critical level, or which the soil test at which the response to phosphorus or potassium or what other nutrient should be relatively zero. It should be very low at that point. If you're maintaining at that point in most of your fields at that point, there's really no reason why you need to get real crazy and do grid sampling. So it really depends on the circumstance and what you know. And I think you build a history with a field. You start off with something more finer scale to see what your variability is. Then just see, what's the best option from there. Because I think there's certainly things that can be done. And I know a lot of people doing zone sampling where they're, there's probably some issues coming in every once in a while that they might need to break those zones out and come up with a different set of sampling solutions. So it's really on a field by field basis is what you want to decide what to do.
Yeah, and certainly I think most growers would know about the variability in their fields if they've been farming that soil, and maybe if it's new land that they haven't farmed before, well, then maybe it merits a more intensive look with the soil sample. But most farmers have an idea of the variability that they're working with. They know about problem areas that maybe need special attention. But one of the things I often think about is, how are you going to manage that? Do you have the capability to manage what you're sampling? We can get, as you said, get crazy. I think that was the phrase you used with our soil sampling. Take lots of samples. But if I can't manage that, then I'm probably getting data that's not very meaningful to what I'm actually able to do. So that all needs to be taken into account as well. And, we sometimes think in our modern age, our information age, that more data is better. And it may be the case, or it may not be the case. If it's going to help me manage nutrients better, then maybe I should get more samples. But again, it's this idea of having a sample that's representative. I think that's a word both of you mentioned. Is the sample I send to the lab representative of the field and how I'm going to manage that field? So let's talk just a little bit about, once I get that number, this interpretation phase of this. Once I get that number, what does that mean? How do I use that? Is that the end of the discussion? I get that number and the lab usually has a fertilizer recommendation printed on it. Is that my answer? And I go to the field with that. So tell me a little bit about the interpretation, the value of those numbers themselves that come back from the lab on a soil test report. How much meaning can I read into those numbers, and what do I do with that?
Well, I know certainly we talk about having too much data, and I think that's one of the issues with a lot of people that send samples to labs right now is that most of the time they're going to get these large soil analysis packages that are going to contain things like cation exchange capacity or base saturation and all these numbers, and a lot of times they're color-coded just based on the sufficiency levels. So a lot of it, really to me is trying to figure out what you need. And I mean, really at this point in time too, with fertilizer prices the way they are when we're recording this, it's really trying to look at what's going to give you the most value in terms of giving you the highest return on investment. And I kind of preach a top-down approach when you start looking at nutrients. I mean, you focus on the big, I'd say 3 now to 4. I mean, and nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur are kind of a good starting point, although the sulfur soil tests most people are going to get on their soil test report, I don't think is really all that good. I mean, there's other ways you generally look at assessing it, and then you kind of work down from there, because that's kind of the problem, because you're going to get this, you're going to get a recommendation. The lab's probably going to give you one. Some labs or some states, you have to get the land grant recommendations along with that. They can be, completely different. Really what I recommend most growers is figure out what your goals are, because, on our end, as researchers, we can come up with the information. It's really what I've been trying to do with most of our growers is come up with some of the information that they need to make their own decisions on what they want to do, because in the end, it's their money and it's the way they want to spend it. And you got to kind of see, if you're a situation where you want to make sure you're okay year after year and you don't want to have to worry about being short on nutrient, then you might be looking at kind of more of that build maintenance approach. Or if you're worried about overall economics, you kind of want to look at, what's my best return on investment. So that's really the problem I think most growers face right now and I think a lot of times, although now it seems like a lot of people are really been locked in for years. I mean, they kind of use the same approaches, and when prices spike like this, and I think we start getting more questions on what are some other options, because the rate recommendations that you're getting, especially with phosphorus and potassium, you have a little bit what I'd call slop in there where, I mean, it isn't a perfect scenario where those numbers are gospel exact or whatever you need to use that. There is a lot of variation because usually putting some on is, better than nothing. And, you've got some flexibility in what you can do. So I think that's really the problem right now, because if you look at labs, they're not really incentivized to be real tight on some of the nutrients, because if somebody uses their recommendations, they're short 1 year, then they might not like that and move to another lab. So they're going to be a little bit stronger on it. So I think it's really looking at your results, looking at what you have for the actual results themselves. And if you kind of want to start investigating in and looking at some different options, I mean, there is some variability out there in terms of what you can do. It's just not to get confused too far into the weeds in terms of what you're getting. And, cation exchange capacity, base cation, saturation ratios, those are a whole different animal. I don't know, Alan, if we'll get a time to talk about those, but you get a lot of information on there, just trying to figure out what you need. And again, I just kind of look at simple, kind of what's going to make the most money and kind of start there. And then if you get years where things are really good, then you start playing around with some of these other things. But you'll get a lot of recommendations on anything, and just making sure that, if there's any decent or credible data behind them is another thing to consider.
So, Carl, in your experience with the specialty crops and particularly with irrigation, where we have control of a critical environmental variable, and that's water supply, my experience is those growers tend to push for every last increment of yield, because that yield is worth so much more than, say, a cash grain crop. What do you see there, and how do you approach the soil test and the recommendation coming off of that for those kinds of situations where you have more control over the environment and you are working with a crop that has a lot more value for each unit of output?
Right. Yeah. So the philosophy is a little bit different. I look at soil tests. It's a tool in the toolbox, and it's one way to figure out where you are with nutrients in that soil. Obviously, if you have a high value crop, you don't want to be short on nutrients. So as I mentioned previously, you tend to be more in that build and maintain approach philosophy, just to make sure that you're going to be not short on those nutrients. So with specialty crops, I'm kind of a proponent of the build and maintain approach for specialty crops. But once you get up into that really high range, I mean, there could be times when, maybe you don't need to be applying quite as much as you were in the past. So again, use that soil test, use some common sense when you interpret that number. And
I like that.
Kind of go for that.
I like that you said common sense, because that number, as we talked about in the beginning, is just an index. And I think I could safely speak for all of us here. We're not advocating that growers are using excess fertilizer. That obviously has economic impact. It costs money. And those excesses lead to environmental risks that none of us really want. And so, Dan, I don't know if you'd care to comment on that part of that, but maybe unfair for me to speak for you, but I think I know you both well enough that we would be in agreement on that.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely something that you have to look at. And that's where common sense comes in too, because if you're over applying and the plants aren't using it, then there is that potential for loss.
And that's one of the things that kind of scares me a little bit right now, because you look at how things are prioritized. I mean, a lot of times you look at corn, nitrogen is always number one because the return on investment's really high. I mean, you throw sulfur in there with the low rates that we need, kind of throw that, some of that high range is nitrogen. Then historically, a lot of our soils were in areas of Minnesota were low on phosphorus. So I think a lot of people will start prioritizing phosphorus applications, and even, situations where going back to that point that, we brought up before, that probability of response is so low that you're going to get something or some measurable increase, that they'll still continue to apply it, then forego some of the other nutrients like potash. And that's the thing that it scares me a little bit is, looking at your soil test is, prioritizing things. I mean, you really need to look at the soil test. That's why it's important, because it'll give you an idea on what's a better option. I think some of the growers have been undercutting their potassium the last few years just to, keep up some of the applications on this higher cost phosphate fertilizers. So that's the thing that, you need to really look at some of this and have some common sense in terms of what's going to be your best option there, because I think one of the big fears with many growers that have built their soil tests up to a certain point is if I undercut my rate, or if I don't hit exact removal for the previous year, that it's going to come crashing down within a year. And we know that's not the case, because the soils have, kind of what I've mentioned before, what we call buffering capacity, or the capacity to resist change or a rapid change, where even without phosphorus application, a good corn crop, we might see the soil test Bray drop by about a part per million a year if we didn't apply anything, if we were starting at, say 20 to 25 part per million Bray. So it just worries me slightly is that, prioritizing the wrong nutrients, and some of these, especially if you might be undercutting yield when you could be saving on costs in one end if you're looking at that and directing it towards something that's going to give you a higher return on investment. So again, it takes a lot of common sense to kind of look at some of these things and not just always get stuck into this, I'm just going to do what grandpa did or dad did or what we did last year. Is if we've got the soil test, that's key to looking at giving us a good decision tool to be able to make year-to-year decisions, especially if we see these fluctuating fertilizer prices in terms of what's our best return on investment from some of those given nutrients.
Yeah, thanks. We've mentioned here, I think, a couple of times this idea of tradition and just do what I did the year before and the year before that, and what my dad did, what grandpa did. And I think with nutrient prices where they are and all the concerns that growers have, it really merits another look at those things that we've done just because it's what we've done in the past, and maybe reevaluating some of those things. And obviously the soil test is a key component of that planning process. It's not the be all end all. I think you both mentioned that. It's valuable information to consider in that nutrient management plan. We've got just a couple minutes left. I wanted to ask you both about something that we see changing in the soil testing world, and that is we're seeing new soil test methods. A lot of people looking at various biological methods and even attempting to use those to make nutrient recommendations and some of these other things. Would you care to comment on the value of those for nutrient recommendations? Or obviously, there's probably some value in looking at our biological community. We're focusing a lot more attention on soil biology and its role in the overall system and productivity. But what about using those tests for making nutrient recommendations? Do either of you have any experience with that?
Okay, well, yeah, I was going to see if Carl had any comments, because Carl's worked with the Haney test in the past. But, the problem with that is a lot of this work that we've done in the past, they've changed that test 2, 3, 4 times since we've done a lot of this research. And that's kind of the problem with a lot of these new biological tests. Is a lot of what's going on right now is it's a lot of testing in phase as these things are being utilized in fields. So you see, while we try to get research on them, we don't always have the end product when we do some of that research. And looking at just the numbers, the issue is soil biology, it to me is, you look at the predictability of it. It's so influenced by weather conditions, temperature, those types of things, that while you can look at the microbial communities, what's there, we have an idea of what these things do. It's really hard to predict, for me, how to forward predict then what they're going to do what they're going to do if we're only getting a snapshot in time with a lot of these tests. And the other thing is too, the cost. If you look at the cost of a lot of these, you look at these soil health tests, they don't really work very favorably if we're looking at something that might cost $50 or more a sample to do anything on a large scale within a field. So what you're looking at is, something that you may have fewer samples, which goes against kind of some of the things that we're trying to do, is manage on a smaller scale variability, and it just doesn't work overly well. And I've been looking at some of these things. Some of the components of them. We'll just go to the Haney test. We've been looking at the H3A components compared to the Bray and the Olsen. The predictability of it's pretty similar. You can calibrate it just like we can calibrate the Bray and the Olsen. The recommendations would be, maybe the ranges would be slightly different because it doesn't measure from the same pool, but it doesn't really perform any better. The question on is the nitrogen side is what we can do with some of these microbial tests. And right now, there's just really a lot of unknowns on my end if there's really any value for it, because we know there's really no perfect scenario, and being able to forward predict what's going to happen in a biological system is really difficult. So Carl, I don't know if you've got any other comments.
Yeah, just a few comments. I think it's exciting, these soil health tests, trying to look at the soil biology. It's something a little bit different than what we've looked at in the past. I think it's a little premature to use them for nutrient management recommendations at this point. I don't think there's been enough research. And some of these soil health tests where they try to come up with indicators, for example, a lot of times those soils tend to have higher organic matter. So you can have a soil, if you go out to the western part of the U.S., we have very low organic matter soils. They tend to score very low on these soil health tests, whereas in the upper Midwest, we tend to have higher organic matter. They tend to score a little bit higher. Yet the soils out in the West, where they have irrigation, are very productive. And so sometimes you can overcome some of the limitations of the soil if you have access to water, you have access to nutrients, those types of things that the soil health test. I think the soil health test might be most appropriate in more dryland situations where, you're dependent on building soil aggregates, building up that organic fraction so that it can store nutrients and cycle nutrients more efficiently. But if you're in a situation where you're in a climate where it's difficult to build up organic matter, it's very warm, more desert-like, you have to apply the water, I think the soil health tests they still may be useful, but they're not going to be interpreted the same as you would in, say, a dryland situation that you would have here in the upper Midwest.
Yeah, I think what I gather from your answers is it's that calibration word again. We still need more calibration research on these tests to understand what they mean and the predictability of the nutrient recommendations that come out of them. So with that, I think we should wrap this up. And I'd just like to ask if there's anything that either of you would like to add that we haven't covered that you think is important that our listeners should know about. Any closing comments from either of you?
So I'll just start here. K-base saturation is one of the things I've been hearing a lot about the last couple of years. Specifically, I go out to Western Minnesota. There'll be a lot of people asking about it. And we've been looking at that. And the idea of what K-base saturation is, essentially what they're looking at is we know there's a certain amount of bases or positively charged ions in the soil, and that there's an ideal percentage that potassium should represent with it. And we've been looking at this, and the numbers that I see floating out there with people targeting 2 or 4%, and with 4% it's just to me insane, just with it, because the soil tests you got to carry in those soils to get it, particularly in a high clay soil, is about twice of what we normally see, where our critical level, or a point at which we hit or 100% maximum yield on averages. So that's one of the things I said is, and if you've got questions on some of this stuff, that's one of the things that people like Carl and I are here for, is just to address questions on, if you see something that doesn't seem right, or just have questions on, certain recommendations you're getting, that's kind of where we're here to answer it. Because, I think some people consider the stuff that we do fairly antiquated, Carl, just because of this correlation calibration. It's been around a while, and some of this new stuff, like Alan, like you're talking about, the soil health tests are new and exciting, that they're the future, that we're antiquated because we stick with some of these things, but kind of stick with where I have data and what I know that works. And that's the main thing is, I've got a good data set right now with thousands of data points in it, with correlation and calibration research that I know that is related to crop response. It's not related to maximum yield, and that's one thing that's important, that a lot of our data is crop response. So it's looking at essentially a deviation from maximum yield, whatever that is within a given field. That the other thing that I see from time to time is some colleagues talking about using a yield monitor and yields collected with there and relating to soil tests. And it's really not a good way to look at fertilizer availability, because we need those crop response models. So, but nice to dig into more of that, but we kind of run out of time on some of that. And we've got a lot of stuff we talk about that online, but it's just one of the things I said, we've got a lot of ability to collect data right now with some of the precision ag tools that are out there. It's just, figuring out how to make them useful and making sure that the data you're collecting is going to be valuable is really the key for a lot of this to make it work.
And to that, I see new instrumentation coming, new types of digital soil probes that are going to allow us to collect so much more information. And again, what does it mean when we get it? Carl, any closing comments from you, things you would like to add?
Just make sure that you choose a reputable lab to get your test from. Make sure that it is certified lab. And I guess just to kind of close, just because we're using a traditional test doesn't mean that it doesn't work. We have a lot of experience with these tests. Any test that you use should be based on research.
So with that, we'll wrap this up. This is obviously a topic that could be discussed for many hours. There's a lot to really get into. There are lots of sources of information on soil testing. University of Minnesota Extension Service. Dan and Carl both have their own blogs and publications. There's a lot there you can dig into on the topic. You can also find more information on soil testing and soil test interpretation at our website, Nutrien-economics.com. That's our Nutrien agronomy website. It's Nutrien-economics, spelled with a K.com, and you can find a number of articles there, some of which are from these gentlemen here that we've been talking with today. So we look forward to having you on another episode of The Dirt, and maybe we can come back and visit about some of these other topics in the future. It's always a pleasure to have you guys on. I enjoy visiting with you. Wealth of information here for our listeners today. Thank you for joining us today.
Farming isn't farming without questions, and now there's a place to go for answers. At eKonomics, an entire team of agronomists are ready and waiting to help for free. No question is too big or too small. Visit Nutrien-economics.com and submit your question with the Ask an Agronomist feature. Why am I noticing signs of phosphorus deficiency even though my soil test says I'm high in phosphorus?
Fantastic question. We often see phosphorus deficiencies when soils are cool and wet. And those two conditions, when a plant's trying to grow, it has an active call for phosphorus, it's trying to pull it in, but the soil chemistry and the soil diffusion rates are too slow to let the crop take that up. So you have a couple options. You can wait for the soils to warm up. If you live in a climate where you're kind of head into warmer conditions, wait for those soils to warm up. It should restore that ability of the soil chemistry to move phosphorus to the crop, and you should be all right. Or if soil conditions are expected to stay cool and wet, you could often add some phosphorus fertilizer and feed your crops that way.
If you liked what you heard today, share this podcast with someone who would enjoy it. Your neighbor, a friend, or your crop advisor. Your support helps us keep these conversations going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a rating wherever you listen.